Dr. Kassab, it's a pleasure to host you again on my very modest and humble YouTube episodes, this time to discuss briefly for a few short minutes on the issue of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as you may well have followed from weeks of news items, we in the United Kingdom, across all four nations, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, we've been fighting against this pandemic. It's been a difficult fight because there was a sense of not being entirely prepared for it. And in a way, things have changed, facts have changed, realities have changed almost daily or perhaps weekly. But in the midst of all this, there have been some good achievements made at this end in order to counter this pandemic wave, just as there have been lots of nostrums, lots of bromides, lots of ideas that do not necessarily sit comfortably, at least, with the way I see the COVID-19 affecting us. And in a way, there have been the grousers, there have been the misanthropes who've said, oh, this is the end of the world, we cannot really deal with it. And on the other hand, there are the Pollyannas and the eternal cheerful optimists who say, no, this is nothing, we'll get through it and we'll manage to come out at the other end. And I think personally that the narrative, the discussions that were had in the UK basically boiled down to two polarities: lives versus livelihoods. And everything that we've done, from lockdown to vaccines to guidance, has been basically, how do you keep the balance between lives and livelihoods? Or in a sense, using my own social justice dictionary, how do you balance materialism versus human dignity? Now, this is in the UK and to some extent in Europe. But what I would like to broach with you is the impact of the COVID-19, of this pandemic, across a wide region, which is the Middle East, North Africa, and Gulf regions. And I thought that a few minutes, just some blue sky thinking, some thoughts from you on where is that region in terms of managing, coping, or not coping with this pandemic.
Well, Harry, in our part of the world, the pandemic hit in the midst of great social and political upheavals. So you speak about lives and livelihoods. Well, we had those problems before the pandemic. As you know, we've been witnessing big, massive protestation movements, devastating wars, dictatorships, occupation. So we welcome the virus in these conditions. So you can imagine that the problems with lives and livelihoods have been compounded by these circumstances. And today is what, June 6th? It so happens that today the demonstrations in Lebanon are resumed. This afternoon, people are called to go on the streets again. As you know, the revolts had started in October 17, and they lasted till January. And once the virus hit, people had to leave the streets and go back home and isolate themselves. Of course, this was a great gift for the governments that are challenged. It was similar, the case was similar in Iraq. So, you know, with our cynicism and black humor in our part of the world, we thought, well, what a nice godly sent gift to our governments. That what a wonderful way to push people out of the streets, to force them to stop their protestation. Today, Lebanese are going back to the streets, and of course, within these 2 or 3 months, the situation has deteriorated massively, and we are no longer just approaching the collapse. The country has collapsed, and it is this situation of total failure of the state that the pandemic is being dealt with. So
let me butt in there, if you don't mind. Let me butt in there. You talked about Lebanon, and you briefly mentioned Iraq, but with my knowledge of the region a little bit, things are even far worse in places like Yemen. There is a war, well, there are multiple wars happening in Libya as well. In all these places, the things that happened in Algeria, for instance, when the pandemic struck, when there were daily and then weekly demonstrations across the streets in the capital and elsewhere, all this was bubbling, all this was happening in a big cauldron called the MENA region. And then suddenly, what comes in? A dreadful virus that we do not know how to deal with. So is there, I mean, for us here in the UK, there is also a realization that this virus impacts the poor, the vulnerable, the refugees, far more than those who are in perhaps a better socio-economic perspective. In a region such as yours, are you feeling any of that from your work, your research, your readings, your contacts with people in the region?
Of course, it's the same with us. People who can afford to stay at home and not work on a daily basis to buy their daily bread, of course, they're better off. People who can work from home, people who still have work. So on that level of socio-economic inequalities, it applies to us too, except that we have the base of poverty is much, much larger in our countries. Perhaps if we want to make a comparison, it's a bit like the racist events in the US being combined with the pandemic crisis. I think what the US is witnessing now is this combination or the coming together of two major crises. On the one hand, the pandemic and the way it is, the controversies about the way it has been handled, and this whole revolt against police brutality against Black people. So if you want to make a comparison, it is a little bit similar, if you want, with our own social and political problems in the Arab world. Just a reminder, when the virus hit back in February, you had 4 countries which were in the middle of really boiling demonstrations: Iraq, Lebanon, Sudan, and Algeria. You had 3 wars going on: Syria, Yemen, Libya. They're still in a state of war. In both Yemen and Syria, hospitals have been systematically bombed in the last years. So the infrastructure is disastrous. The poverty level is very high. You have Palestine under occupation. You have Egypt under heavy repression. So obviously
in Egypt, it's not only a question of repression, but by repression, I would also add that there are lots of people in those countries, including in Egypt, who are in prison, jailed, and prisons are viral environments.
So to go back to your lives and livelihoods, I think its reality is much more alarming in our part of the world. And people were in the middle of their struggles to address those issues. And here comes the virus. And so the struggle is somehow going on. but those in power, of course, are obviously manipulating all of this. So once under the pretext of controlling the infection, all sorts of ways of scaring people to force them to stay at home, and using the argument of law and order to have increased police brutality and so on. So we're not doing very well. I think we are in a very alarming situation, but there is so much people can do, and the struggle continues.
When I started, I mentioned that in this part of the world, in Europe and certainly in the UK, I divided it into the Pollyannas and the optimists versus the grousers and the misanthropes and the pessimists. In the MENA region, including, of course, the Gulf, which is also impacted by this virus, all 6 countries of the Gulf region are, in fact. In your part of the world, is it too early to start thinking of what lessons could be learned from all this? Is it that at the moment people are in the middle of the battle and that will come later somehow ex post facto? Or is it basically that people are beginning to tease out some ideas of where things went right or wrong?
Look, the lessons have been learned long time ago, that you need political participation, people's participation, to make sure that the states take care of health and education and economic prosperity and so on. So the virus just comes to exacerbate things. There are no new lessons, I'm afraid, to learn. If you guys are pendling between optimism and pessimism, well, I think we are reaching deeper and deeper levels of exhaustion and despair, in fact.
Well, that is a somber message and a somber idea to leave my viewers.
Sorry.
And no, but it's a realistic one, and perhaps people have to hear it, first of all, to understand what's happening in your neck of the woods, but also to be able to know that despite all the miseries we are experiencing, there are people also who are having a harder time at it. So,
without that justifying that the lesser unfortunate should suffer at all. I mean, I think nobody should be victim of mismanagement and neglect.
That is quite true too. Listen, this is once again another one of those short vignettes. I wish we could elaborate more. We can't. Dr. Kassab, thank you very much. Good luck. And all I can say to you and to your friends and family, keep well and stay safe.
Same to you, Harry. Until next time.